I know I don't always get to talk about documentation. A lot of times I just get to talk about tax software, which is clearly not the most exciting thing in the world. So I kind of like the documentation we've done. A little history of me. I learned Microsoft Basic on a Commodore PET in 1978, and I mostly did it by hacking games and breaking them so that I could win them and cheat and stuff like that. So I got a degree in philosophy, which really taught me, more than anything else, that it's actually worth digging through some impenetrable philosophical text sooner or later, because you might actually come across a nugget of something worthwhile. But hopefully we don't all have to go through that. So anyways, I recently did Avalara's sales tax filing system, which is really a very behind-the-scenes sort of project. And then I immediately jumped to building Avalara's public API. And the big thing that I didn't expect when I switched was that there was nobody there to write documentation for me. There was nobody there to support the API. And it was really clear afterwards, just, they'd kind of thrown me into the deep end and kind of hoped that I would dig myself out. So anyways, I came across this while I was preparing for this. I just think this is a great quote. Documentation is how we program people. If nobody else has said it, I'm going to claim this one, so maybe this is me. But what we're doing right here is I'm trying to write documentation to tell other people how to use my software. So I'm trying to write something and teach people a subject that, in the case of tax, nobody wants to learn. Nobody wants to learn it for any reason. The only time you want to learn it is when your boss says, all right, you have to be the one to write the tax integration. Well, anyways, part of what I did is I said, I'm going to repeat myself, because a lot of the people that I talk to are not really listening most of the time. I talk to a lot of people, and I talk to a lot of customers, and I talk to a lot of partners, and in general, most of them hear about every third or fourth thing that I say. I give them a whole bunch of documentation, they'll maybe skim it, they'll hand it to somebody else who will skim it. So part of what I'm looking at is I had to write the same documentation over and over again. When I started building this API, I thought everyone in the world would know how to authenticate. I mean, it's just HTTP basic, right? You put your username and your password, you put it in a base 64 encode. Nobody knew this. We would have people calling me up every hour of the day saying, why didn't my authentication work? I had to write page after page after page of just basic authentication explanations. And what I started to do was to realize that I'm going to have to say the same thing multiple times in order for people to get it. Because each person is going to have a different learning style. I spent some time at Knowledge Adventure, which is the company that made Math Blaster and Jumpstart. I hear some people have recognized it. And one of the key things that Knowledge Adventure said is everybody has a different learning style. They had a bunch of different characters, and each character would teach the exact same lesson in a different way. So if you were learning, third grade math or fourth grade language arts, they would have 10 different characters, and each character would give you the exact same lesson, but they would give you a slightly different reward, and it was just to try to grab the kid, because you didn't know exactly what it was going to motivate the kid. So anyways, repetition is key. It's totally worth doing. I had to go into this organization and turn it from one where no documentation existed to one where everyone was going to write it with me. I knew what documentation I wanted as an API developer, but all of my partners and all of my customers, they wanted different documentation. Some people came into it just saying, I only want the basics, I want to learn these 3 things and be done. Some partners said, hey look, we need to understand everything, we need to be certified, we need to, and so we did a lot of stuff. Jeff, could you hold up the book over here? The end result, which my colleague Jeff Meisner has graciously printed for us and brought with us, we created a book out of all of this documentation, and the way we did it is we pulled in people throughout the entire company. A long time ago, there was a tiny little group, and it was under the marketing organization. And that group was tasked with writing API documentation. And they didn't do a great job. They did a pretty good job, as well as they could be expected to at the time. But what they discovered was that after a while, they lost touch with the developers that were writing the code. And so what we said is, this time around, we're not going to just task some poor person in marketing with doing the docs. we were going to bring everyone in together. So we decided to bring in people from customer support, bring in people from product organization, bring in people from partner launch, business development. We reached through every part of our company. We had a 1,500 person company at the time. We said, we're going to find a representative of each different department. We're going to ask them, what kind of documentation do you wish you had? Because every one of them needed something slightly different. So looking at different people, I started establishing rules for how each person was going to contribute. I said, well, all of my programmers, as I was hiring up people on board, we have Wayne here. Wayne joined my team about 2 years ago. First task I asked him was set up your desktop and edit the wiki page for setting up your desktop to fix all of the mistakes I made when I wrote the wiki page. And part of that is just teaching him, hey look, everybody is responsible for this. Wayne developed a talent for writing documentation, interfacing with customers. Now it's his full-time job. He manages a couple SDKs and a couple sites for the developer relations team. It's pretty awesome. And he did it by starting as a developer and starting as someone who worked on the API, and I think that gives him an authoritative voice. But it wouldn't have happened if we hadn't forced every developer to do a little bit of documentation. So there's that. We went to the customer support team, and we discovered that the customer support team was getting lots of tickets for the same thing over and over again. The item about base 64 encoding authentication was one of them. There were so many tickets. People kept on having trouble with this. This is the most basic thing that I could think of in the world. It was written in the original HTTP specs that I think Tim Berners-Lee wrote back in 1991. We've all had to do it since then, but people just didn't understand it. So we had to go back and go through all of our support tickets and say, every time somebody gives us a new support ticket, we're going to answer it by linking to the documentation. If we don't have an answer that is directly relevant to this question, we're going to write it. Well, maybe we're going to write it after we get the same question 3 times. We get too many tickets every day to write one for everything. But that's the idea, is rather than just answering one-off questions, rather than just answering the immediate problem at hand, we want to build documentation that solves the problem for the long run. So this is how we find a lot of our blog posts. I think we're going to do one on postal delivery. But yeah, questions?
A common process for this is the knowledge management process, where you use a knowledge tool and you train the support reps when you get something like that. There's a very simple sort of draft that they can do, and then you could approve, reduce, etc. But did you guys use any special tools to write this these topics, or did you have did you try to make it easy for these folks to be able to write a draft whenever there was something that came in?
Well, actually, this is an interesting story, because Avalara for a very long time has been selling prepackaged solutions to customers. It's only in the past 2 years that we started getting a significant number of customers that were writing their own code. So part of what we uncovered is that these customer support tickets were ones that the organization was totally not prepared for. They had a process for how to research a problem and write a knowledge base article, and then send the knowledge base article through reviews and get it approved for publication. But the problem was that that worked really well when you were explaining someone how to click the buttons on their accounting package. It did not work well when the question was, how do I write code to add an exemption certificate?
Gotcha.
And our customer support team was totally flummoxed.
Yes.
And flummoxed is a great word, so I love using interesting words. But basically, we had to go through this and partner with them, because they don't yet have the programming skills to do this. So Wayne and the other team members on the developer relations team will help them out. And what they'll do is we'll look for possibilities, and we'll write blog posts explaining tutorials for common programming tasks. So that's a lot about customer support. I'm also pushing our product owners to be better about this. I don't know, do you guys all have a product organization within your companies? I see a couple of people nodding at least. Product owners are a really interesting thing that I first encountered a couple of years ago, but I've encountered many of them that like to write very, very complex, voluminous documents with all sorts of information about competitive marketplace or something. I'm trying to push them to condense it. I want them to write documentation that somebody could use to understand the feature that they're asking us to build. Because if they can't condense it to something that's easy to understand, if they can't condense it into a series of agile stories, it's going to be really hard to be sure that we can build it. So where they used to write 13-page, documents with, incredibly long lists of detailed requirements, we try to ask them now to give us a story, to give us an explanation, and to take something that we can turn into test cases. So I've just encountered too many circumstances where the documentation was just too dense. And really, this isn't one of the challenges. Everybody has to contribute to this documentation task. A lot of people will refuse when I reach out to them and say, hey, I want you to help with documentation. Well, I'm not good at English. English is my second language. I just don't know this topic well enough. Oh, I'm just not a good writing person. Why don't we just hire someone to do that? What I tell them is, you don't need to be an author. You don't need to be a talented writer. What you can do is just help us spot the problems. You can tell us where two documents should link to each other. You should tell us where a document is too hard to use. Just today, right before I got on the ride over here, somebody sent me a message saying, this error code doesn't make sense. And I said, did you read the documentation page for the error code? They said, I didn't know that existed. I said, well, did you know that every individual error code includes a URL that links directly to the documentation page for that error code? He said, no, I didn't. So I said, great. He said, but it's too hard to use. I said, as soon as you've read it and told me if you can understand it, then I will do my best to improve it. So if people are just trying to push off and not try to help, I'm looking for ways to drag them in and get them to assist. Because everyone is responsible for making this documentation easy to use. If the documentation isn't easy to use for you, that means there's probably 10 customers out there, maybe 100 customers out there that have the same complaint. I'm asking everyone within our organization to tell us how it can be better. We're actually embarking on an annual refresh now for our documentation. And what we ask each team member is, what did we forget last year? Did we omit some topic? Has there been some change since a year ago? I know that one of the big things that happened in the sales tax world was the Supreme Court's Wayfair decision. Does anyone in do any of you guys know what that is? Holy crud.
Yeah. I write some tax software for a small business too. Basically, they're opening up the door for sales tax across state borders.
Pretty much. And we have to explain that sort of thing. We have to go there into the documentation and say, this didn't exist a year ago. If you're building a solution with our software, we need to tell you the things that you should be aware of. Our documentation is not just about the technical how-tos. I'll cover this more in a second. Our documentation is not just about the technical how-tos. It's also about what do you need to know in order to build a good solution. So let's get into some editing here. I have an interesting example. I picked a really small thing because I figure I can talk through this relatively quickly. But I am constantly editing our documentation. Every single release, the team will tag documentation with little to-do markers. And we have a GitHub alert process which sends me a warning every time somebody marks a documentation with to-do. But they constantly say certain things need to be improved. I get tickets, and I try to work with people to say, how can we take this documentation and make it better? Well, here's what I'm learning. I can say the same thing over and over again. I can repeat myself many times because chances are this particular piece of documentation that I'm writing, it exists in 3 other places, but this user only clicked the direct link to this one page. So I have to remind myself every time I'm working on a single piece of documentation, it doesn't matter if I think I've said it 10 times before, I should say it again now. So I may have written the same thing over and over and over again, but some people are just going to jump into this one page and they need to find that explanation. So this was the original documentation for the Avalara Avatax sales order object. It was pretty thin, but we thought that it was very self-explanatory. The person who wrote this is a good friend of mine. He's based out of Pune, India. He's actually pretty good at this sort of thing. He does a really good job of putting in some basics. And what he did is he wrote sales order, estimate or quote, default. He also wrote another thing, says this is a temporary document type and is not saved in tax history. So that's a little bit of useful stuff, but if you're encountering this fresh, you probably have a bunch of questions. What is that little default thing at the end? What does that mean? You probably have another question. What is tax history? What is a temporary document type? So part of what I did is somebody came to me a while ago with problems with this, and I said, you know what, this documentation has stood for 8 or 9 years now, it needs to be improved. So a couple of changes that I made. Is first thing is I turned this kind of blurb of text into a kind of descriptive sentence. So sales order, estimate, or quote was a very factual statement. I wanted to turn it into something that you could read and go, oh, okay, that's kind of what this object is. So I phrased it from the perspective of someone who's looking at the object, said, oh, this object represents an estimate or a sales order or a quote. I wanted to lead with the word that a novice would understand first. Not everyone may know exactly what a sales order is. In fact, some systems, talk about sales orders in a variety of different ways. What I wanted to do was to lead with the word estimate. There could be arguments, maybe quote is the better word, but that's the one I picked. I liked using a more full sentence rather than a snippet. The default value was not really clarifying anything, so I just cut that out. Next thing, there was another sentence that I needed to do. I needed to put in there to explain what was the purpose of this sales order object. So what I added is I wrote a tiny sentence and I tried to explain what it is that makes this object different from all of the other objects in the API. So this document type is used before the sale has occurred. So I'm trying to give the person some context of when this object is valid. So who, what, when, where, why. You got to look at it and say, what's the most relevant thing that somebody's going to need to understand? In the case of sales tax, we want people to use sales orders when something is not finalized. We want people to use sales invoices when something is finalized. So the difference is a sales order is in your shopping cart, but a sales invoice is when you've committed to the order. Now, that's a great explanation, but you'll notice that I didn't put in there anything about shopping carts. And the reason is because probably 60% of our business is companies writing accounting systems. And those accounting systems don't have shopping carts. So I didn't want to use the terminology that would only be relevant to a subset of our system. However, if I get more complaints, if people come back to me over and over again and say this doesn't make sense for people building shopping carts, then I would probably reconsider and add that language. So the purpose of this text was to contrast to the sales invoice. And so I've just given you the brief explanation of what the sales invoice is, but the difference is the sales invoice is used to record a final transaction and calculate the final tax amount. Remember, repetition is key. You can totally repeat yourself with all necessary information. Some of the words in this are superfluous, but my goal here is to try to give people an explanation of what it is they're looking at. Finally, I decided to add some solutions for common problems. And this is where I start to add in additional text based upon how I get customer support tickets. If I got tons and tons of customer support tickets that were about people implementing shopping carts and they didn't understand sales orders, then I would have to add shopping cart language into this. But as it turned out, what people were not understanding was the difference between company code and customer code. So I wanted to explain that and explain who was the seller and who was the buyer. Moving on, beyond this individual use case, we spent a lot of time looking at just the general value of our documentation. We are trying to repeat ourselves. We are literally trying to write the same documentation in many different ways. I can see some people are starting to get the pattern here. I have to take the same documentation and rephrase it because I'm going to be saying the same things to an e-commerce developer. I'm going to be saying the same things to a cash register developer. Be saying the same things to someone who's building a plugin for their accounting system. But I have to say it in slightly different ways, using slightly different language, and eventually they'll find the thing that they want. What we're doing is we're reminding them that there's really useful bits of the documentation, and we're trying to make it possible to link one piece of documentation to another in a way that makes it convenient for them. So my two main use cases for documentation are, in one case, somebody asks me, how do I use this? And in another case, somebody says, I just can't remember the syntax. These are the two main types of questions that I see. People will come to me and say, I'm really new, I want someone to walk me through this. How should I use this? Like, you've got a tax API, what do I do with it? How do I use it? So I write a story, and I explain it, and I tell them whether this API is right for them. I tell them some best practices. I tell them why we built it the way we built it. But on the other hand, if somebody is just Googling at the last minute, man, I can't remember what the parameter name is. I want to make it really easy for them to find the definitions of fields, the maximum string lengths for fields, that sort of stuff. I want them to very easily find the parameter names, the field names, the model definitions, links to the software development kits that we publish, all of that sort of stuff. So what we've basically got then is, how should I use this? You need a user guide. I can't remember, we need reference docs. And so I think of this as like a user guide is the pamphlet. And Jeff and I have been working together. We're going to be handing out little one-page pamphlets. And all the pamphlet is going to be is just, hey, you're an e-commerce developer, you should read these 10 pages of documentation. Hey, you're building a cash register, you should read those 10 pages of documentation. And in order to save ourselves a little bit of typing time, all we're doing is we're pointing to the detailed manuals that they need. But on the other hand, if somebody is just looking up something, we have pretty good long-tail Google rankings for our docs. If somebody was to Google Avalara sales order model, you would probably find our model right away. And you'd be able to look directly at the JSON definition, be able to look at the example object, and so on. What does this look like in practice? Our reference docs are based on kind of like the MSDN style. We really like the idea of having a single page per object. We have a single page per method, we have a single page per model, we have a single page per definition, and so on. There are a lot of toolkits nowadays that are based on OpenAPI and Swagger, and there are a lot of people that have created documentation that scrolls infinitely. So essentially, if you have 10, 20, 30 APIs, you could have a page that's 5 miles long and you're like 65% of the way down it. Well, what I was discovering is every time I'd be using that documentation, every time I'd go into a presentation, I would accidentally click an arrow key and it would jump me 5 pages off in the wrong direction. I would have no idea where I was. We want a single page per thing. We want our customer support team to be able to give you a link that drops you directly on the page, regardless of whether your browser renders you, higher or lower than it should. Equally well, we also spend a lot of time on the exact definitions of each object. This is probably a little bit hard to read from the back, but we have field names, we have field attributes, and we have an explanation for each field. And in some cases, we will even capture example values for some of the more complex fields. We spend a lot of time on that. This is probably 65, 70% of our documentation time is just making sure that this is correct. Because this drives the accuracy of everything else. If we do this right, then the people that are telling the stories can just link to it. So this is what I'm really spending our API team's time on. And we ask our developers, every time they add a field, they have to write an explanation for it. If they're not sure, they have to tag it with to do in the source code, and then that gets tagged in our code review process, gets escalated to me, and I'll help them edit it. On the other hand, user guides are where we write stories. These are where we write marketing one-pagers, or little how-to guides, or little handouts at conferences. So what we'll do is we'll prepare a handout, and Jeff will come up with a story. He'll say, I think we're talking to a lot of people that are building, marketplace like Etsy or Amazon, where a whole bunch of people sell things on a gigantic platform. So we'll write a one-pager that says, in order to build that sort of thing, you need to read these pages in the documentation. So we've got multiple layers. Each layer of documentation can refer to the other layer. And as you can see right here, there's a nice little table of contents on the left-hand side, and each page is a story. Individually, we use a lot of Markdown. So I don't know if you can see this, but these are the little code snippets in Markdown. And we try to just emphasize, as I'm sure all of you do, which things are code and which things are text, which things are intended for humans, and which things are going to be copied and pasted in your documentation. We also use a lot of links. We're going to include links like this. Whenever we point to an API, we're not going to give you a full story of every parameter in the API. We're just going to link you to the reference material. That way it just reduces the amount of typing we have to do, and it means that people are able to skip through this stuff very rapidly. Because that's what people do, that's what programmers do. Every one of us is in a rush. Every one of us has been given a deadline from somebody who is pushing us to get more done with fewer resources. And so they're going to skip to the part of the documentation they want to find, and that's why we have to repeat ourselves. Repetition is totally okay. The more you do this, the better, because sooner or later somebody's going to jump into the documentation and they're going to find the one thing that they needed. Even if you had to write it 10 other times, it's going to be useful that once. So really what you're doing here is you're recognizing that people don't always read what you give them. And we accept that, we acknowledge it. We wish they'd read every word we wrote, but that's just not realistic. So I just wanted to open up for general questions, and I'd love to hear if any of you have thoughts on documentation, or if any of you want to take a copy of our reference documentation. We have some copies of the developer guide. After we wrote it on the website, we actually decided to print it out so we could hand it out at events like this. And it's actually been a pretty fun experience. I know it's technically not something people need if they have good online documentation, but I got a lot of compliments at our user group. We would hand it out to people who are not technical, and they would say, oh, thank goodness, I can hand this to my programmer. I know it'll be just what he needs. So thank you all for listening. Is there anything that I can answer for you?